everybody. Welcome guests, members and public, and members to this morning's session of the Assembly Police and Crime Committee, the first one of the new municipal year. Members of the public elsewhere and within this building can follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting and discussion using hashtag Assembly Police. As ever, please turn off or to silent your various electronic devices. First of all, apologies.
There are none, Chairman, and in addition, Assembly Member Arnold is attending today.
You're very welcome, Jeanette. Thank you for coming along today. Item 2, declarations of interest. Can ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in the item 2 on the supplementary agenda that was issued earlier, and as ever declare any other disclosable pecuniary interest that are not already so mentioned. Can we also take items 3, 4 and 5 at the same time? Note the membership and chairing arrangements set out on the supplementary agenda that were agreed at the AGM, which is absolutely fine. Moving on at pace. I haven't missed out, I guess, yet. Well, it's a very busy pre-agenda, isn't it, today? Minutes of the meeting. Can I confirm the minutes of the Police and Crime Committee 7th of March and the list of actions and actions under delegated authority? We're getting there. Yes, don't worry, I have to plough through this first of all. Item 9, very important, the response to the committee's report on gun crime. Can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor on the committee's report? And I'm going to bring Len in a minute and note the response to the Metropolitan Police. Len, did you want to come in now before we take the questions from the...
Yes, Chair, it's concerning committee business, and I just wanted to make this point. In the recent media announcements concerning our scrutiny on tackling violence of knife crime and gun crime, my group, the Labour group, was slightly concerned at the tone of some of the media coverage. I don't think it's wise for this committee to even give a perception that we may have prejudged an issue before we've heard the evidence. And so I think from an expectation from our side is that when we take some care about some of those media announcements, some of it we know how the media operates, some will put words into your mouth, Chair, some of it may well have been your own. At this particular occasion, I just want to put a marker down for the future about how sensitive we deal with that, but I don't, more importantly, I don't think it is wise for this committee to get into prejudging issues before we hear the evidence, and there was a tone and strand of that coverage that indicated that. So I just want to raise that point.
I guess duly noted. I mean, there were some reservations around how some of the timings of that. This is without being critical of our media colleagues, and there's some lessons to be learned around that. And I accept that, Lynn. So thank you very much. We'll make note of that. Right, so now we get to item 10, which is the question and answer session. Thank you very much, both of you coming along. Deputy Mayor Sophie Linden, Helen Ball, Assistant Commissioner. We've got a range of questions. I will commence with the first set of questions, which is the question which is the priority of Londoners very much at the moment, which is tackling violent crime. A month ago or so, on the 11th of April, again we had you here, Deputy Mayor, with AC Martin Hewitt briefing us on the issues and how the Met and the Mayor were aiming to tackle the issue of violent crime. Still, the figures go the wrong way, and still we're losing far too many of our young people. At that meeting, the new tactics of the Met were announced around the task force, around use of stop and search and Section 60, and what we want to do in this next period is for you both, and Helen particularly, to talk to us about how that's been effective and update us on that. So I'll start the set of questions, if I may, around that. Now, first of all, Assistant Commissioner, if I may, can you provide us an update on the work of the Violent Crime Task Force and other measures since AC Hewitt spoke to us a month ago, please?
Certainly. Let me start with the resourcing of the Violent Crime Task Force itself. We have an ambition to raise that to 158 officers working as a core group to tackle violent crime, violent street crime. At the moment, we have 113 officers and police staff in place and working towards that effort, and we expect our full complement of 158 core members of staff to be in place by July. So we're very pleased with that recruitment, and we have a cohort of people at the heart of our operation to tackle violent crime who are picked people, volunteers, very, very committed to doing this work. And they come from a range of different places in the organisation. So they bring expertise, for example, in tackling violent crime because they've been part of Trident, and in tackling serious organised crime because they've been part of our serious organised crime team, as well as experience of working locally at Borough. So that unit is forming. It's already very effective operationally, and I can come on to that. It is also complemented, I think you're aware of this, at the weekends, during the week and at weekends, with other officers who are a more mobile resource that can be deployed to the latest intelligence that we've just received. And that's an extra 88 officers each day on a weekday, or on Monday to Thursday, and then Friday to Sunday, an extra 150, 160 officers. And those, as I say, are a mobile resource available to be tasked to the latest intelligence. So last weekend we had, on Friday, 341 extra officers working to tackle street violence, on Saturday 301, and on Sunday 222. And it is our intention to continue working in this way, that we have a core team increasing, and that is supplemented by extra officers as required. But it's not just down to the Violent Crime Task Force and their additional units. For example, roads policing are operating to make sure that they incorporate weapons sweeps and responding to intelligence of violent crime within their normal routine business, and there are other examples like that. And we've also working with the City of London Police and British Transport Police as well, to make sure there's a coordinated effort right across London. So that's what I'd like to say in terms of the resourcing of the Violent Crime Task Force and the other additional resources that the forces in London and the Met are putting to this.
Pick up on that then before you cover other items. You mentioned, I think, the word extra twice and additional. These aren't additional officers, are they?
These are additional officers that are being paid for through the extra funding that we've received for it. And we are recruiting to backfill those officers. I'm sorry, you're not able to hear me terribly well.
No, that's fine. No, I think I can. It's, we're leaning forward in rapt attention. But no, I think the point, and it was mentioned by the Mayor, I think, is that the worry is that many of the, if I may say, many of these officers, we are told, are covering these task force through cancellation of rest days, overtime, etc., etc. That didn't really come out in your description as an extra sort of task force.
That certainly was the case when we initially launched it, because we had to move people very quickly into those roles. Now what we're able to do is that those people, their roles are being backfilled or their absence is being managed, and this is a much more sustainable way of operating going forward. So we're having less short notice movements of people from roles or shifts that they're expected to be performing. We're able to plan further in advance, so people's working and life balance is not being disrupted in the way it was, and we're still able to backfill through the use of overtime, but in a much more sustainable way.
So the backfilling will still be overtime by other colleagues who will be backfilling the duties of these task force colleagues. It won't be extra officers per se on the streets of London.
Well, there are very, in terms of how many people are coming from roles that were operating, for example, as detectives and not actually on the streets, I can't give you the actual numbers. But yes, some people have come out of roles where they were more office-based and doing investigation and are now working on the streets of London. And those absences are either being replaced in those roles, or through planned overtime, their core jobs are being performed still.
Okay. I interrupted your train, so you'd like to continue briefing us around use of Section 60 and stop and search, as described by ACQ. The colleagues might come back to that earlier point in a minute.
Okay, so we have increased use of Section 60 and stop and search, both throughout the Met and by the Violent Crime Task Force itself. So across the Met, for example, there were over 12,000 stop and searches in April. That's a very high number. Those stop and searches are still yielding in about 30% of cases we take further action. Some of those are translated into arrests for knife carriage, but not all of them, and I don't have the exact figure for that. But in about 30% of all of those cases of stop and search, we're taking further action of some kind, and that's an extremely useful activity.
Our briefing notes was, I think it duplicated 18.8% were successful. You say it's more like 30%. Had an outcome, shall we say?
I know
Jeanette's going to come.
We may be describing slightly different outcomes,
Yeah,
so I think I'm saying something useful has come from it in 30% of cases, and then you're right, a tangible outcome in more like 18%. Yeah.
And sorry, what was that figure again, sorry, for the number of stop and searches you just gave?
I said over 12,000 in April across the Met. Our use of Section 60 has also increased. We've given a Section 60 authority over 120 times this calendar year. That's resulted in 1,500 searches under Section 60. So not enormous numbers under each Section 60. You know they're only given where there is belief that serious violence will occur, or after serious violence, in order to search for some kind of weapon. So they are being used, very carefully. They're very well governed, and it's an authority that is given deliberately and not lightly. And I think that it shows, a proportionate response to the serious violence incidents that we have had, and it is very much a preventative measure that we are using it for.
On the Section 60, and I understand the use, and colleagues again may have some points around that. How are you, and I know you have to react operationally in quite quick time, but how are you, briefly, how are you communicating that with the community or community leads? Is there, I believe there's a process around that when you're contemplating a Section 60. Are there conversations with IAGs and etc.? Absolutely
is a process, but I regret that I'm, because I'm not close to it, I can't give you the full process. We can certainly write to you after this meeting, and I'm sure Sophie may be even more aware of the process than I am, but you're absolutely right. There's a very clear process of making sure, both beforehand as the decisions are made and during the operation, that communities are communicated with and there's an understanding of that activity. In future, we're looking to deliberately mobilise communities even more so that they are out with the officers during the conduct of the Section 60 and are able to explain to people who are coming across that activity exactly why it's happening. I'm going to ask two more points, then I'm going to bring Jeanette and Andrew in. Jeanette's coming in as well, but I want to pursue just two quick points. I'm going to bring colleagues in. So just reflecting on your point about the overtime, there's more likely to be a sustainability of these task force going forward and less pressure, because we were concerned, and I think the Mayor had been quoted, been concerned about morale of the Met. How is the morale of officers at the moment? Are they working too hard? They work very hard, of course, but is that a concern at the top echelons of the organisation? Officers' morale? I think the Commissioner and the Management Board absolutely agree that officers are working, and staff indeed, are working extremely hard. What we are very glad to see is that there is a really strong sense of purpose, that the task force themselves absolutely want to be doing the work they're doing, and they're seeing some results, and it's early stages, but it looks as if at the moment the increase in some of those crime types is stabilising, and I'm not going to make any claims for it at this stage, but that's, for officers to see those results is really gratifying, and it's really motivational. So I think, yes, people are working hard, but I think morale is high because we're starting to see some results from this activity, and we expect to continue to. And I have one more question, colleagues. It was mentioned by AC Hewitt and others that, and we must talk briefly about gun crime, which is increasing in London, is that the Met, we understand, is reviewing its gun crime strategy. Is that the case, and how is that proceeding? I don't recognise that we're doing a formal review, but we are continually updating our gun crime strategy, which is a 4Ps strategy. I've looked at it myself in preparation for this meeting, and it's very comprehensive. However, it will be kept under continuous review, and I'm not aware of a more formal review that's happening at the moment. If I'm wrong about that, I will put that right after the meeting.
We'll pursue that separately.
Yeah.
Right, sorry. Jeanette, I saw you first.
Yes, Chair, thank you for giving me attendance rights. It's just that the sad and tragic issues that are taking place in my constituency, my constituents would be concerned if I didn't join this committee on a short term and be able to put questions that they've raised with me, especially over the 12th and 13th. And that was particularly about the unusual step that was taken to put a borough-wide Section 60 across one of my boroughs. Now, we can all understand, and in fact, the directions that we've got here talk about the use of Section 60, their geographical scope and duration limited. How is that the case when you then apply that across a borough? And what are we to make of that other than a state of crisis in that borough?
Well, it certainly wouldn't be right to describe it as a state of crisis. I don't know the decision-making in this particular instance, so I will make sure that I check that afterwards and give you a full explanation of this particular instance. And I can only assume that the decision-maker at that point felt that the intelligence picture was showing that there could be serious violence, but it was not possible to narrow that down to a particular location, which is what we would always want to do, because we would want to have as narrow an authority and as narrow activity as possible. And I can only assume that the decision maker at that point felt that they weren't able to identify particular hotspots to narrow down the authority.
Do you appreciate the level of additional concern that this creates?
Yes.
You answered the Chair's question quite rightly by saying that key stakeholders are informed. In fact, I'm informed about it when it's specifically geographical, but not this time when it was borough-wide, because maybe of the need to work quickly. But how is it possible to have that sort of resource to be able to liaise borough-wide with the key stakeholders? And then the additional thing is, isn't there a danger then about not being able to guarantee a quality of service that we would all want when you have hundreds of staff employed or whatever, deployed across a borough?
We must always work to make sure that the people who are deployed under Section 60 really understand their powers and operate them properly. And certainly, it's been said before, the introduction of body-worn video is a very useful way of checking that is happening, but that's after the event. So we've done a large amount of training with the staff who are involved in this way. I absolutely recognise your concern about a borough-wide authority and whether we can be as targeted and as careful and as proportionate under such a wide authority. And I think the best thing I can do is to check the decision-making as to why it was implemented in that way, and then what was done in terms of community engagement in respect of such a wide area that was put under a Section 60 authority. And I'm afraid I'll need to come back to you after the meeting on that.
And the outcomes, and indeed any review of any concerns that were picked up via the video camera evidence, that would be appreciated. And then lastly, can I just put a question to the Deputy Mayor? Were you aware about this borough-wide Section 60 as the political leadership of the police deputising for the Mayor, or was the Mayor aware? Shouldn't there be some conversation with the elected leader? Because this was nowhere near the promise that was made to Londoners that they would have borough-wide Section 60 put across their borough?
We aren't consulted about the operational decisions because it is an operational decision as to when and how and where a Section 60 goes in place. But in terms of oversight and scrutiny, that is something that myself and the Mayor scrutinise on a monthly basis around stop and search, and also in terms of the oversight board that I chair to have oversight and scrutiny over the whole of the Metropolitan Police. Stop and search and Section 60s as part of that oversight, and I would expect to see that when I next have my performance oversight board, which is next week or the week after next. So that will be my opportunity to scrutinise that.
Did know beforehand?
I wouldn't expect to be consulted about operational decisions like putting in a Section 60, which has to happen in fast time.
A borough-wide Section 60, you don't think that's something that you should know about?
I think it's something that I should have the opportunity to scrutinise and have oversight on, and I do that regularly through monthly performance reports and the oversight board. And I have an oversight board coming up, and as part of the performance report, the quarterly report, which you'll have and is published, that information should be around stop and search, and Section 60 should be within it, will be within it.
Lastly, do you know how many borough-wide Section 60s there's been this year?
I haven't got that information in front of me at the moment. It's what I would look at in terms of the oversight board, and those papers are being prepared at the moment in terms of that information. I wouldn't expect to be, as I said, consulted on the implementation of an individual Section 60. It is an operational decision. It is quite right that myself and the Mayor have oversight and scrutiny of that, especially where there are significant concerns around it being borough-wide or a community not being properly consulted.
I think I'm putting to you, Deputy, that a borough-wide Section 60 is grave, and that I think if you went out and spoke to 10 Londoners who were informed, they'd expect the political leadership of this city to know whether a borough-wide Section 60
What I'm talking about is the immediacy of that knowledge, and absolutely agree with you, we should know, but it's about whether we know on the night or the evening or the time it is put in.
Okay, I'm going to bring Andrew to come. I've got a couple of people coming. I think, Helen, perhaps you can write to us after the event. This will be one of the actions you're probably noting, to write to us about what procedures and conversations you had around that borough-wide, because I think I agree with colleagues is that borough-wide Section 60s are unprecedented is the wrong word, but rare and significant and grave. And I would partly expect an informal conversation, perhaps from the Commissioner to the Mayor, saying that we are going to invoke that tonight, possibly. So let's hear, when you write to us later, that'll be fine. Andrew, I saw first, and then...
A few more questions on Section 60. I mean, just following on that last one, I don't think it's just a question of Sophie being consulted on notified. I think it's also a question of the borough leader and the executive, presumably by the local borough commander. Though presumably, as it has to be authorised by a commission, by somebody of the rank of commander or upwards, the decision may be taken once removed from the local borough. Indeed, we had a Section 60, I think it was renewed as well, in place after the 2 murders in Camden in February. Further question on Section 60. What's the average and longest duration of a Section 60, including any back-to-back renewals? And secondly, how many Section 60s have there been this year, not just on a borough basis, but in total, how many Section 60s have there been?
I'm afraid I don't have
you may wish to write to us on that one, Helen.
I think the duration is very important. This is supposed to be an emergency measure, so if they're in place for more than a couple of days, I think that's quite a serious issue.
There are rules around how long they are in place and how many times they can be reviewed.
Yeah, so, well, I think the one in Camden was renewed once, so it would last, I think, about 48 hours altogether, but I might be wrong about that. But it'd be useful to know not just how many there are, but also if the renewal is back to back, I would count that as one, as it were, rather than 2 in terms of duration.
Yeah.
Done? Sean?
Yeah, just again on that Camden incident, because that did happen in February as well. Every question that Assembly member asked about the Hackney incident to get the details of...
Not Hackney, not this
time.
Sorry,
not Hackney, sorry.
Not Hackney this time.
The incident she was referring to, can we have the same scrutiny of the Camden decision as well? You promised, we have to go back over the transcript now, but you promised some information. Can we have the same information about the Camden Section 60 as well?
I think to summarise, we would like a list of the Section 60s in number and in duration, which is the point Andrew made, but also some detail around when you've got the borough-wide. What was the process in the implementation and the consultation. People are interested in that, I think. Okay, that's fine. Now, moving on. Jeanette, you've got another set of questions on the matrix, I think.
Shall I bring the matrix in now? Yeah. It's to Helen. Some months ago, myself and Assembly Member Desai and the Deputy Mayor for Community Engagement and the rest of his title, Matthew Ryder, we met with your colleague Pat Gallen.
Yes.
And we raised then our concerns about, what could I say, the need for a review of the gang matrix. And Pat and officers present recognised our concerns and said that she would get back to us. In fact, she's now retired. But
she hasn't yet retired.
Right. And so Assembly Member Desai and I are still waiting for that. But since then, we now have this being picked up as an issue at international level. What can you tell us about where you are in the process of reviewing this very much needed review of the gang matrix?
Do you mind if I pick that up? Because that's a review that's being led by myself and MOPAC, and of course I was at that meeting that we had in January around...
Sorry.
We had with Pat and Matthew Ryder and also officers from Trident. We are in the process of reviewing it. We expect to have published and recommendations around that review by the end of the year. At the moment, with our teams in Evidence and Insight are looking at evaluation in terms of what happens around when individuals go onto the matrix and what happens to them, not just around enforcement, but also around the diversion and some of the support that does happen through the matrix. That review is ongoing. It's a review that I've discussed on a monthly basis with Pat Gallen when I have my update meetings with her, and I also will be discussing it with the Commissioner in my next meeting with her, because as you're absolutely right, there's been the report last week which was critical of the gangs matrix, looking at the disproportionality of the gangs matrix, and this review is specifically looking at what is the matrix for, looking at, in terms of, issues around disproportionality, and also looking at what happens when individuals are on the matrix. Of course, this is all underlined by the matrix being a risk assessment tool which is used for operational policing by the Metropolitan Police, but we are having those discussions and we expect to have those recommendations at least by the end of the year.
I mean, can I just say briefly, Chair, if you go back to concerns I've had, it goes back to when I sat on the Metropolitan Police Authority, and my colleague Caroline Pigeon will say those concerns are still relevant, and it just seems to me that there doesn't seem to be the urgency, either through MOPAC or through the service, to deal with this issue and its impact on particularly young black Londoners.
I absolutely see the importance of this review, and that's why there is actually a significant piece of work being undertaken and really quite in-depth evaluation around the individuals that go onto the gangs matrix or come off the gangs matrix. This does take time. It's not because we don't think it's important, and it's not because we don't absolutely recognise some of the real concerns that you have and leading members of the community and some members of the community have around disproportionality and the fact that there are a significant number of what looks like disproportionate number of young black males on the matrix. It's not because we don't recognise that importance. We are undertaking the review. It's an operational tool which has been effective, does have an impact on the individuals, not just in terms of enforcement, but in terms of enabling them to leave the gang lifestyle or leave what they're doing, the criminality that they're undertaking. We are undertaking that review and we'll publish it as soon as it's ready.
Could I add to you've seen the urgency, I think, with which we're tackling, with a whole range of partners, with which we're tackling serious violence. We absolutely recognise that urgency. And part of that is that, as it was in the days when, for example, I was working in Trident and we had a lot of conversations about this issue at the time, 10 years ago. So our victims and our perpetrators of serious violence, but particularly our victims, are disproportionately from black minority ethnic communities. And the gangs violence matrix is a way of identifying people who are already involved in serious violence and are on the path perhaps of being drawn into serious violence. If we can't understand who the people are who are involved, then it's very difficult to actually tackle that problem and reduce that serious violence. And that might be through an enforcement approach with some people who are perhaps already offending. Absolutely, though, the gangs violence matrix involves people who we want to safeguard and protect and divert from offending. And it's a really important method of understanding who's involved, the level of risk that they are at, as well as the level of risk that they pose. And so I would absolutely describe it as a very important method for understanding and tackling serious violence.
Do you appreciate the need for the review? A 10-year-old tool that was suspect at the time, surely it's time for that to be reviewed.
No issue with a review. I don't remember it being... I think the discussions about disproportionality are what I recognise as being 10 years old. I don't think this matrix has been in place. But, please have, always try to work out who are the people who pose a risk, and therefore what are we going to do? What's the intelligence picture, and therefore what are the best interventions? Who are the people who actually are at risk of being drawn into this really dangerous activity where they are disproportionately victims of it themselves? And what are we going to do with others to protect them? So it's an old methodology. It's an important methodology. And whilst our victims of violent crime continue to be disproportionately from black minority ethnic communities, then the gangs violence matrix, I think, will show that same sort of disproportionality because it's reflected.
I think we understand that. For me, it's more about the effectiveness of it, which I think the review... So, Flo, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, just quickly on that. I think one of the issues around the uproar of the gangs matrix, which again I'll agree with Assemblymember Arnold, is that it has been around for a long time, is the fact that people feel that it's discriminatory in the way that the young people who are on there, there's no way of knowing when they've come off, if they're still on there, how long they've been on there, and access to that information. I think that's where some of that anger and uproar from the community is coming from. And when you look at the figures, the fact that you've got young people as young as 12 on that matrix, these are children, and if they've never been involved or anything, but they're suspects by the police and they're on that gangs matrix, it's almost as if they're tarnished with that reputation. So I think to say that we can have the review is great, but actually to say it would be better for us to say everyone we know on that matrix who has not been involved, maybe they should come off.
That I think would be an approach that might put people in danger. So there is nobody on that matrix where there is a basis for everybody being, if you like, identified as being at risk or posing a risk. There is a basis and it's objective, and that the basis that is there, the intelligence picture that is there, means that it's vital that we take some sort of intervention, whether it's protective or enforcement. It's vital that we or partners take some sort of intervention to protect those people, and that's why people are on the gangs violence matrix. I absolutely agree with the review, and the review I know will address those questions, and the Met will always respond both to concerns that have already been raised and to the review. But I do want to explain that it really is an important way of working, that we identify people who are at risk alongside those people who pose a risk.
Okay. I mean, we'll obviously return to this. We'll look at the review. We're doing a significant thematic piece of work around violent crime. That may well inform that. So we will return to the subject, and thank you for your time there. I'm going to bring Caroline in because over the recent months we've had a range of meetings, a range of announcements, announced by the Mayor. And Caroline, you've got a few questions around outputs.
Yeah, I just, before I get into those, I wanted to pick up with the Assistant Commissioner just to clarify. I was listening very carefully to the questions and answers about these officers, these additional officers. The 158 clearly are officers in post and you're backfilling or covering their substantive roles. But these 88 officers out on weekdays and the 150 officers out on the weekends, presumably that's officers doing overtime?
I think some of it is, but not all of it. So, you know, this will change week by week as we're able to do our planning more and more in advance. So, you know, a month ago, we would have much more use of overtime for that weekend cover. Now, we've been able to plan weekends, and therefore we are able to adjust officers' duties in advance, and therefore the overtime...
Is the officers then potentially being taken from some other role, a borough role or something else, put out patrolling where you want them to be?
Now, my understanding is they're officers who would not otherwise have been working those weekends.
Okay, so well, I think I'd like some more detail on that, just to really to make sure we're very clear what the reality is of this additional resource going in, if we could please. What I want to pick up, I'm going to ask questions really to the Deputy Mayor. As the Chair has said, there have been all these meetings, lots of coverage between March and May, lots of meetings on violent crime. What I think we'd like to hear is absolutely specific examples of outcome and output. What is happening from those meetings that is substantial, that, you know, Londoners can hear and think something is being done to tackle this serious issue?
So there has been a number of meetings, and some of which I've attended, not all I've attended. Some of it has been around listening to the concerns of the communities. For example, I went to Camden after the January awful incidents in January in Camden. That was as part of the Camden's consultation on serious youth violence, and it is also around hearing the concerns of the community and ensuring that the community understands how the police are taking this seriously, how the local authorities are taking it seriously, and also how us and City Hall are taking this seriously. It's difficult to put a tangible outcome on that because that is around reassurance, it's around hearing those voices. I know that Camden themselves will be publishing a report on serious youth violence before the summer with recommendations as to where they want to go forward. In terms of what it means for City Hall, we've taken that back and we've looked at what we need to be doing in the looking at the criteria for the Young Londoners Fund, which is £45 million worth of money going into youth services, youth work, youth centres over the next 3 years. That has absolutely, those discussions, not just in Camden but across London that I've been having with communities, has influenced the criteria for the Young London Fund around what can be, you know, what can be eligible for that. So that is a tangible outcome that I think has, well, I know that has come from that, because I've certainly taken my discussions that I've been having and brought those back into City Hall. It has also enabled, I mean, there's been some, in terms of the police officer operations in some of the meetings and discussions that we've been having, that stepping up of the Violent Crime Task Force and the prioritisation around the Violent Crime Task Force, but also the discussions that we've been having with the Metropolitan Police about ensuring that when enforcement goes in, there is reassurance to the community as well, and that community neighbourhood policing is absolutely maintained. So those are the things that I have certainly taken from the community meetings that you mentioned that I've been having, and some of the other meetings I've been having, and those discussions with the Metropolitan Police of trying to balance what is rightly a step up in enforcement, because we have to tackle this awful scourge of violence we have in London at the moment, but also balancing that to ensure that the community feel reassured by it and know what's happening.
Should we set out a bit more, maybe in writing, what that reassurance bit is alongside the enforcement actions, because we're getting clearer information about the task force and whatever. What is it? What is the package in a borough, in a community, that goes alongside it to reassure them that's come out of those meetings? That would be very helpful. But if I just, as a local resident, as in London, how would I know what's happening in my borough to prevent and stop violent crime?
As a local resident, well,
as an ordinary Londoner, if we go, you know, any street in London, how would they know what's being done? They hear all this in the news. How would they know what's being done in their borough?
In terms of communication around what is happening around enforcement, we are from City Hall putting up communications a lot around what is happening across London and locally to tackle violent crime. We're also, the boroughs will also be doing that themselves in terms of their own communication methods, and also through neighbourhood policing as well. And of course there's the Safer Neighbourhood Boards and those community ward panels that are always there and have regular meetings to have, you know, put out those messages, and to have not just put out the messages but have the discussions with those members of the communities that are there around what is happening and what needs to happen.
Are you reviewing that to strengthen it at all, perhaps in particular parts of London? Or?
I'm constantly looking at what we need to be doing around community reassurance, especially with a step up in enforcement, because it is important. We've heard already today, you know, absolutely appropriate concerns around Section 60, stop and search, the gangs matrix. It is really important that we continually look to see how we get those messages across, and that we understand how the community are responding to this, because it's not just, it's important in terms of reassurance, but it's also important in terms of, you know, that absolute fundamental tenet about policing by consent. We have to understand how the community are feeling, how they are responding, but also how we can ensure that they are part of the solution as well, because it's not just about giving messages out, it is also about saying the police can't tackle this alone. They have to have the community working with them. They have to have the intelligence from the community, intelligence from families, difficult though that can be, and the intelligence from community leaders around what is happening locally. So it's a two-way street. It's not just about pushing messages out.
Could I just, would you mind if I could just absolutely reinforce that? I think it's really important for the officers who are carrying out that enforcement activity that they see it firsthand, if you like, the impact on the community, and are able to adjust their practice because of what the community say to them. So we're very much asking communities to join in the activity, whether it is through weapon sweeps or mobilling alongside us in a Section 60, as I explained, and joining in other ways in future. The other ask, as well as join in, is effectively be a good neighbour. If you see someone who is, you think, at risk of being drawn into serious violence, then talk to somebody. It needn't be police, could be the school or the local authority, but talk to somebody about your concerns. And then the final one is help us by giving us the intelligence or the information that we can use to protect communities. So very much, you know, join in, help each other, and help us to protect communities are the three kind of key messages for communities.
Thank you. And in, I guess it would have been April, the Mayor had a summit. The Mayor had a briefing that London MPs, council leaders, assembly members were invited to. And at that interesting discussion, it was said there would be a set of actions for the Mayor and partners. What progress has been made? Where are these actions, please?
Some of that is transformed into the set of asks that we have actually of government, not in a party political way, that we are feeding into the Home Secretary's Violent Crime Task Force around what we think each of the individual government departments should be doing, not just in the medium to long term, but actually in the short term, to get on top of this problem. For example, what should schools be doing? What should the Department of Education be doing? We are lobbying quite hard around Ofsted. We've had really good partnership working with Ofsted. They're doing a thematic review around knife crime and what schools are doing to tackle knife crime and keep their children safe. But we are lobbying quite hard in terms of we want that to be part of the statutory safeguarding framework for Ofsted. But we also think that the Ministry of Justice has a really significant role to play, and that's part of the asks that have come out of that summit that we are feeding into the Violent Crime Task Force, as well as we, following on from the Violent Crime at that summit, the Mayor wrote to each of the individual government departments that we think are pertinent to this, tackling violent crime, to set out to them, these are our asks. We want this to be driven through the Violent Crime Task Force, but we expect every government department that has a role to play to be stepping up to the plate on this.
Okay, that's your ask of government. Mm-hmm. I was at that summit, and the elephant in the room clearly was resources, and that was put to one side and all that, but that clearly is there. But that's not a set of actions, that's your ask of government. What actions between the Met Police, yourself, councils and others have come out of that summit?
In terms of actions that have come out of the summit, I have, from the local authority side, I've been to speak to the group of London chief executives around prioritising violence. We have another meeting with all the directors of children's services at the beginning of June around prioritising violence, and what came out of the summit was a clear need for the spreading a good practice across London with a set of consistent standards and measures and consistent measures, and we are holding an event towards the end of June, inviting all chief executives, leaders and heads of community safety to absolutely, in terms of, it's not a conference in terms of come and listen to us speak about how important it is. It's what I call a working conference, which is really about these are your borough action plans. We know you've all got them. They're being reviewed and assessed all the time. But we think that you should have these consistent standards, these consistency across London, and that's spreading a good practice.
Okay, thank you. It might be useful to see set out some of those actions as well in this lengthy letter that you'll be sending to us after this meeting. And is there any potential for conflict, or does it complement that the Home Office have got this task force, they've got their own plan, and yet you have a London-wide strategy and with the Mayor? Is there some potential for duplication or even conflict between what the Home Office are wanting to do and what you as London representatives want to do?
I think the Home Office's Violent Crime Task Force are welcome it in terms of, you know, it's good that they are getting some of government together, not all of government. The Ministry of Justice wasn't represented at the last Violent Crime Task Force. They have a huge role to play in terms of prisons, probation, Youth Justice Board around violent crime, especially the types of violent crime we're concerned with. Is there potential for conflict and duplication? There's definitely potential for some duplication, and what I have been discussing and we have been pushing with the Home Office is, for example, they're putting £11 million, which is £11 million across the whole of the country, compared to £45 million from the Mayor just for London, into early intervention. We have said to the Home Office, look, there's a potential for duplication on this. Just delegate down, as you do with victims commissions and other types of commissioning, delegate that down to the police and crime commissioners for them to commission this out, because they know their local areas, they're best placed for this. At the moment, the Home Office is just talking about aligning that budget. That's not what I think is appropriate. I think this should be actually look at the local decision makers, London, City Hall, and we can do this because we have already set up the procedures, the budgets to be delivering a lot of this, and you should be actually putting that towards those rather than setting up dual funding mechanisms, which is really complicated for community groups. We had community seed funding, the Home Office now has community seed funding. At the time we said you should be pushing these together. They're not prepared to do that at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just two very quick questions. Can I just take you back to stop and search? Assistant Commissioner, you said 12,000 was quite a lot. What was that comparison with in previous months before the task force went into operation?
Which was 10,000.
Thank you.
March was, stop and search in March were, so it's a bit blurry. I think it's 10,858.
Is that about the average then that we would have in the preceding months?
It's fairly
okay, so 12,000. Okay, can I just move back in terms of the community piece? One of the issues of the cuts has been the cutbacks of some of your detective capacity in reaching out to people and gaining some of that confidential intelligence that goes on. So in terms of, it used to be borough-based, I think it's now gone to a number of other boroughs. So I'm thinking of the detective capacity along county lines, drug dealing and some of those issues. Are you reviewing that in the new setup of BCUs around intelligence? Because we were told by the previous Assistant Commissioner that intelligence and data is quite important in tackling violent crime and pushing that down. So what's the plans then? What's new within the Met and the new thinking about that? Because intelligence has always played a part in driving down crime. What's the new thinking?
Plays an extremely important part in driving down crime, and you want to have a well-balanced range of different sources of intelligence, some from covert human intelligence sources, for example, some from surveillance, some from community information, and if you get all of that coming in, then you can start to make good judgments about the right activity to take. So as we are reviewing and carrying out our change programme, the intelligence function has been reviewed. There has been various different proposals for that going forward, and I'm not up to date on exactly where we've landed, but I know that the Commissioner's direction is very strong, and Management Board agrees with it, that the sustaining of intelligence from all of those different sources is absolutely vital to the Met succeeding in reducing crime.
Okay, well, we'll return to that in terms of maybe borough mergers or whatever sometime in the future. Let's go to at the other end of the spectrum, the community input in LP, people coming forward, and I think you referred to that. Am I right in thinking of areas where you're tasked then and where you're going into that I should be expecting to see and the revamping of materials, accessibility, not just at meetings, because people don't always go to meetings, about how I can communicate to the Met confidentially. I don't want to, maybe I don't want to speak to you for all sorts of reasons direct. So what are we doing new then in areas that you're moving into, asking people to come forward with confidential information? So the things I'm seeing is revamped publicity around Crime Stoppers. I'd want to see a much more multi-agency approach, not just the police there in terms of urging people to come forward. I've not, and you know, I'm close to some of these issues. I've yet to see that really take place in a way that gives me confidence that we're opening up some of that path. We say it, but do we actually do it? And are we walking the extra mile to getting people to come on board about their part in driving down the violence we're seeing in our communities?
We want to have different ways of encouraging different groups of people to talk to us. Certainly in my experience, one of the best things is stable, trusted figures in that community. So it might be your Safer Neighbourhoods dedicated ward officer, it might be a schools officer, it might be a teacher or someone from the youth service. But it's all of those people being stable and trusted, and if they're known, then people are more likely to tell them things, even to tell them, you know, in confidence with anonymity, but to tell them information. And so quite a lot of that, a lot of our approach is making sure that communities understand and see and work with and work alongside officers in, you know, in those stable and trusted positions. Then I think there are some members of the community who would use Crime Stoppers, and certainly we would regularly you know, inform people about the Crime Stoppers number and the other ways of telling Crime Stoppers and the value and the confidentiality of it. And I think it is a trusted means of getting in touch for some people. And then there are some people in communities who don't trust Crime Stoppers. They're wrong, it is confidential, the cause can't be traced, but they don't trust Crime Stoppers. And for those, we need to have, I think, you know, more of a sort of a covert human intelligence source approach that really respects their concerns, their fears, and is very secure around the confidentiality with which they're treated.
Answer, but I'm also looking to what's different when we're using data or using some formula about going into areas. If I'm a professional or not, or maybe I'm not, am I really being, is there someone telling me, am I receiving emails saying, well, actually, we're involved in this area and you need to understand you can go to X, Y, Z if you have information that's important in terms of tackling crime or violence in this community? Mm-hmm. Are we doing that? Are we, is that part of the plan of the work that you're doing with the Violent Task Force and work with the multi-agencies down on the ground in areas where you're targeting? Is that a piece of strand of work that is undertaken?
Absolutely. A strand of work that's undertaken is making sure that our intelligence coming in is as strong as it possibly can be. Specifically, are people receiving emails encouraging them? Probably not. I don't know, but probably not. And I can go back and see if that would be felt to be an important part of that strategy. The important thing, though, is yes, absolutely, it is our part of our strategy, deliberately to build the intelligence that's coming in from all different types of groups.
Susan.
A lot of what I was going to ask has been covered. One of the things that interests me a lot is around communication, though. I mean,
No, you do, yeah.
we don't hear the Met say loud and clear, and it's absolutely true, is that you need every single tool in the box to assist you with dealing with the crime, especially with it rocketing around Section 60. And I don't think communities understand, because we're not telling them enough. If you look at the matrix, I mean, I've worked with lots of police officers who think it's fantastic, and having people on the peripheral of the gangs matrix really does help. And as you've said now, to keep them safe. It is going to be disproportionate because, unfortunately, the black community, it is disproportionate there. And therefore, because it's down there, we should be really looking to see how we can aid the black community to assist with them not being victims, let alone the assailants. I'm thrilled to hear you actually say it, because very often the Met shies away from these things. And perhaps if you were to be more clear and say, this is how it is, this is, we're just putting it down there, because when I was looking at some of the news reports, it's almost as if police officers were being racist by putting black members on the gang matrix. I don't believe that to be the case at all. And people that are on the periphery of the matrix, I have seen that being used when on borough level, you're looking at people that might be drawn into gangs, and it is very important. So communication sometimes, I think, the Met, it strikes me sometimes, is on the back foot and defending itself, when perhaps it would be more appropriate to be out there saying loud and clear, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it.
I understand your point. I think I certainly, if I look at the Commissioner's communication since she's been enrolled now for just over a year, she's very clear and she's very much out there and explaining what it is we're doing. In relation to specifically the gangs violence matrix, we had a set of answers, if you like, to some of the questions. Not all of that was reported. It's useful to be able to speak today. However, I think the important point is, as well as the fact of the disproportionality, which I've explained, I think the other important point is that we know our communities are concerned by the operation of the gangs violence matrix. We know that whilst I think they are very confident in the activity we're taking to reduce serious violence, if we aren't working with them and completely alongside them and communicating well with communities, then they might start to lose confidence in that. So it's more important for the Met really to listen to what communities are saying to us and to act on it, even when we might want to defend our way of working. Actually, in the end, it's probably more important that we retain confidence by showing we're listening and we're adapting to what our communities are saying.
Can I just pick up this point about communications and importance of reassurance for the community, because absolutely as part of the borough action plans they have been asked and they are reviewing again around that, getting those messages across. And it is, again, it's, as I said earlier, it's a two-way street around messages, there's around information flow, because it is so vital. But it's not something that the Met aren't doing, it's not something that the local authorities aren't doing or boroughs doing. We could always do more of it, and that's absolutely something we need to look at. But they really are getting the messages out to the community that they, they are out there undertaking, tackling, making sure there's enforcement on the ground, and that there is that communication going on. And it's going on in all sorts of different ways, not just emails or meetings, but it is doing face-to-face through meetings themselves and with individuals through boroughs as well. And at the moment, when I look at the figures around trust and confidence in the police, and you look at that overarching figure about are the police doing a good job, at the moment it's remaining fairly stable. So we are not seeing it at the moment, the diminution of the communities and the public's confidence in the police. And that's alongside what has been very, very worrying violence. But we are always making sure and is reviewing how important, making sure that we're getting those communication messages out, because of that flow of information, and that reassurance is so important.
Good. We're moving on. Peter, a quick question, then I'm moving on to Len, and then we'll go to the next.
I've got a question, yes.
Please do.
Assistant Commissioner, I wonder if you could just tell me, looking at your experience, the past years, how long is the gap, as it were, between the kind of measures that you're now putting in place, whether it's Section 60 or upping stop and search, and them having an effect? So, as I understand it, what I'm trying to establish is, as I understand it, there's always a kind of gap between people either knowing that there is strong stop and search or thinking it's very relaxed, and obviously then the result of that. So what is that kind of time span? When would you expect to see these measures having an effect?
It's a very difficult question to answer, and it will vary between different crime types and different interventions.
Knife crime.
In terms of knife crime, we've, as I've said, started to see the increase stabilising. We haven't yet moved into reduction, but we've started to see the increase stabilising, I think, from the start of this calendar year. Thank you.
Start of this year?
From the start of this year, yes.
So we've had
60... might be moped-enabled crime, which has reduced over the last year by 50%, which is a very big reduction. Sorry, theft of mopeds has reduced by 50%, and moped-enabled crime has reduced by 40% over the last year. Now, when the Commissioner arrived, she made it a very early priority to reduce down moped-enabled crime, and that had about, I think, 6 months to take effect. But then when it did, we've actually halved the theft of mopeds over the last year, which is a very strong result.
So you're talking about I absolutely see that. So basically, we've now reached a point where suddenly people are finally taking this seriously as being a crisis and people dying. So is this...
I wouldn't characterise it in that way at all.
Well, I would actually. I think it's only just now that we have these private summits and everything with the mayor and all the... It only happened last week or whenever it was.
No, but that's
anyway,
not true.
Could I say that if you're
putting...
We're talking about Section 60 and we're talking about you being basically on the mayor saying we should up, stop and so. So you're saying, what, 6 months' time we might see a sudden reduction in, what is it, 2 or 3 deaths a week?
No, I was simply trying to illustrate with a different crime type that we are confident that we will achieve results, but that knife crime at the moment is stabilising. So at the moment, the increase has stopped increasing, it's stabilising. But I said right at the start, I'm making no claims for that at this stage. It's much too early to say. And actually, I may have been mistaken to try to illustrate with a different crime type, because it's very difficult to say when you would start to achieve results. All I would say is we are already starting to achieve results in terms of the seizures of firearms and knives. Those results have they've always been coming, but they're increasing pretty well every day at the moment. So those are very strong results, and they're a testament to the work that people are doing.
Okay, so just finally, a meaningful stabilising, right? So for most people watching and being horrified by what's going on, basically a meaningful drop in the number of people dying would be, you can't give me any sort of estimate, 2 years, a year?
I don't think that's
We've had this before, haven't we? We've had
peaks
before.
So
how long does it take?
What I can say is what I do know, that in terms of the homicides, if you like, in London, in April and so far in May, they are considerably below February and March this year. So the indicators are encouraging, but if I project into the future, it would not be professional of me to say what I would project into the future.
Okay, it might give some people reassurance, but anyway, thank you.
I absolutely want to reassure
I take
people.
your point. It's a fair question to be held to account, but I think we're looking at clearly a significant reduction. How that's measured is for the committee to judge, and we will continue.
And I would say, I mean, we are, it's very, very early days when we're talking about knife crime with injury and we're seeing the stabilising. But in terms of the murders, every murder is so appalling on the streets of London that we are not, there is no complacency here whatsoever, and that's why the Violent Crime Task Force is out there all the time focusing on really serious violence. And I'd just reiterate the point that Assistant Commissioner made around, you're asking about when we'll see the effects. You see the effects every day when weapons are taken off the streets and those that are carrying the weapons are arrested. I mean, in 2017, because of enforcement action, nearly 3,000 knives were recovered. January to March, that was nearly 700, and just in April, it was nearly 300 knives. That's immediate effect. Those people have not had those knives and should have been arrested at the time, and that's an immediate effect on the streets of London. And just could I just pick up also on what you said about all of a sudden we've decided violence is a problem. That is so categorically a misrepresentation of what has happened. From the moment the Mayor has made tackling violence a priority within his manifesto, the Commissioner, when she came in, said it was a #1 priority. We published the knife crime strategy last June, and we have been delivering on it. And rightly, the focus, absolutely rightly with what is happening in London at the moment and across the country, the focus is maintained. And we are maintaining that focus and will do so until we see significant reductions in murder and knife crime.
Hang on, wait a minute. The Deputy Mayor came back to me, so the fact you say this has always been a priority, yes, everyone can say it is. The fact is I absolutely would stand by that point, that, you know, right from New Year's Eve on, when 4 young people were killed, you know, and it seemed to be still quite a peripheral thing, not being taken seriously. And it's taken this long to have that sort of summit thing we had, which frankly didn't really seem to achieve very much. But the idea that somehow this has been a huge concern, no, we're talking about it now because it's suddenly got to this stage of 60 people dying.
I think there is validity in what Peter's talking about. I haven't been on the sharp end of the radio this morning. Londoners want to know what's being done about it.
Absolutely right.
And they don't. Yeah. They aren't over impressed. Peter, let me just. You've had your say. Londoners aren't necessarily over impressed with strategies and conferences and conversations. What they want is a downturn in the numbers, and that is how this building and the Met will be judged upon, and this committee will judge you and others on the downturn, on the downturn in figures. Right, let's move on to Len, and then we're going to go on to some other questions.
Just before I move on to sanction detection rates, which I've gave notice to your office, Helen, that I was going to be asking these questions, some of these questions. I just want to go back to a point that the Deputy Mayor made around information gathering and all the rest of it. And I recognise what you're saying. Then I think if that is the case, you should be able to tell me where there is a differential of the areas you're operating in with an increased number of people coming in with information compared to areas where we're not targeting. So I'd like to see that. The reason why I asked that set of questions is I passionately believe more of the same about basic telling people we're open for business and we'll take your information, or whether we've got the capacity to do it at the high end of that information gathering is one where I think we have to think differently about, because the resources clearly are not there. But when we are in times of woe, then we need to act differently and think differently about how to get that message across to the community. Because I'm still clear, like on Clare's Law, there's a lot of people on domestic violence who don't understand they can access information like that. There's still a lot of people and a lot of professionals that will not know the alternative way to give information to the police in driving down crime. But I'd like to see the differentials, if we are doing something different, if it's working or not. Let me return to sanction detection rates. Last year, the MPS launched its crime assessment policy, screening out crime. Lower level crime wasn't going to be looked at. We're going to be looking at the high-end market. In this particular case of today's discussion, it's violence, right? So in that sense. So in the year-on-year figures that have just recently been published, both sanction detections fell by 15% on the previous year, and the sanction detection rate was 3.4. Now, this committee knows the difference between, can you make big judgments or about that? Traditionally, it's a big issue for the Met and performance indicator that we follow. There are some issues that don't come into it. We talked about last year when I asked the Commissioner about domestic violence, because it's a complex crime, doesn't meet, sanction detention. This is not the way that I should be judging the performance of the Met. But on almost every other crime here, it is not looking good. Now, crime is going up. You bringing people to book for those crimes is going down. What discussions have been going on within the senior management team about this, and what are your plans?
Martin Hewitt and his colleagues in territorial policing hold crime fighters meetings which reflect the performance meetings that are held at every borough and in future at every BCU. And sanction detections are one of a range of measures that they look at. They're particularly, of course, focusing on preventing crime. We'd much rather prevent the crime from happening in the first place than show a good sanction detection rate afterwards. So they hold this under continual review, and I know that they have been looking at this as an issue, but it is only one of a range of issues of performance that they look at. I've looked at our overall sanction detection rate rather than the individual crime ones, so I'm afraid, so I know that that fell last year from just over 16.5% to just over 13%. I think that there will be a range of reasons for that, and some of that will include the increase in crime that we've had, because we have had a crime increase, and of course that will lead to, or it may lead to a decrease in the detection rate because of the greater volume. We also had a large number of abstractions from the core crime investigation function last year because of the terrorist attacks and because of the Grenfell fire and because of an increased preventative focus for serious violence as the year moved through. And I think some of those have meant that there's been less capacity in some of that post-event investigation. And of course, as you've yourself referred to, we're seeing more complex offences where in some cases domestic violence is one, some sexual abuse allegations are others where sanction detection isn't necessarily the right answer. So I think there are a range of factors for that. We are broadly similar to our most similar forces. Don't think for a moment that means complacency. It doesn't. It just is, we would always go and benchmark to see what's happening elsewhere, and we're broadly similar to our most similar forces. Looking towards the future, the work that's done as the BCUs roll out in equipping officers to investigate crimes, particularly response officers, to right from the start of initially attending a crime report and investigating it right the way through to the end, that ought to have an effect on our sanction detection rates, and our officers are all being trained to do that. And we are gradually, as you know, increasing our numbers of detectives, and again, I would hope that that would have an impact. But I can assure you that Martin Hewitt and his team are very clear and keeping this under review.
Right, but let's go to the borough mergers. We're going to come on to it again later on, but even in your pathfinders, the performance isn't good, it's below. One of them marginally, the other is a couple of points. If we start to extrapolate what this means in tackling real crime, I don't want to add to the grief, in terms of if we'd stayed the same at the previous year, it is pretty substantial and pretty significant. So I hear what you're saying about what's going on, but so one of the issues that is drawing me to this is that the capacity for the Met to tackle this and significantly get better outcomes is severely undermined because you just haven't got enough police officers, right? It's part of the story, not all the story, part of the story. And you have tried to work out that the crime assessment policy is a way to get in there better, but it don't seem to be making an impact. In some ways, in terms of what was introduced by the Met last year, we should start seeing the signs of that. Now, you were not cited on the individual crimes around that, and I'm not going to challenge you because that would be not the right thing to do. So, but, you know, I am, but it's not making a difference. And somehow, when would I expect that crime assessment policy to start making a difference where you're prioritising some of the violent crimes that we're talking about today?
We are already prioritising the violent crimes that we're talking about today. That's a clear priority. We've heard that for the Met. So those crimes are already prioritised, and but particularly we're looking to prevent them. So we are taking a proactive and preventative approach as our first priority. Then it is obviously important to solve those crimes and detect them, and that is absolutely part of our strategy. And I don't think that certainly serious violence is not impacted at all by those new changes, because those will always be prioritised in for investigation.
Now, I think you probably have done some work, so we've done some work as well in my team around some of these issues, and we think if you'd stayed the same as the previous year, which I think is an interesting one for MOPAC to start asking some questions and further questions around, that you would have about 868 more crimes with offensive weapons would have been solved, 10,000 odd violence against the person related crimes would have been solved, and 3,988 thefts from shops which would have been solved. Now we've used what your policing formulas would have done. I presume someone has done that back at the shop in terms of trying to tackle these issues and understanding why, when you have those grip and pace meetings with the boroughs about why it's important to drive this up. Because I'm not, you know, I've heard what you've said, but if this trend continues, we are really going to be in a very serious situation here, where I think not just the arguments that we need to make to government about future issues, but also where you're prioritising those efforts. Because, you know, the one thing that I'm quite clear at, Cressida Dick has said that she wants to come back this year to talk about what the police shouldn't be doing in the future and what it should be concentrating on. That's fine. I'm very privileged to be part of that conversation, but it's not the conversation that needs to take place in this building. It's a conversation that needs to be taken with the public, I think, because about public confidence. So we may generate public confidence in that sense, but there's a thing about saying, you know, I support the police in tackling crime, which is part of my public confidence issue, but really having confidence that you're going to solve it and get to grips with it is another one, and that's why I'm raising it in this way. Chair, we may need to come back to this issue in more depth in the future to see how well the Met is getting to grip with this and see where it goes.
We probably haven't got time now to do it full justice, Lynn, but I'll take that point. Just take that as noted if you don't mind. We will write to you after this meeting and we'll have an exchange of correspondence confirming that, and Len will give us some details around that. Right, I think it was important that we spent a significant amount of time on that subject. We will need to pick up the gear slightly for the remaining questions. Len, do you want to take some questions on BCUs?
Yes, thank you. Maybe less contentious, maybe more straightforward. Who knows? Let's see where we go with this. It's a question to the Deputy Mayor. Can you just... the levels of performance, such as response rates that you're seeing in the in the Pathfinder BCUs. What's MOPAC's view on that? The level of the performance of that and the response rates within the Pathfinders. How are you gauging that, looking at it, and what's your conclusion at this stage?
In terms of the oversight that I have in not just the Pathfinders but in the rollout of the BCU model, because as you know that's what we are in the Met are in the process of undertaking at the moment. I have monthly meetings with Martin Hewitt and DAC Mark Simmons to have that oversight of what is performance like, and some of the issues that we look at are the sanction detection rates. Absolutely, you're right to look at that performance in terms of emergency and 101 calls, but also around safeguarding and how we can look at the safeguarding, not just around some of the hard figures, but actually what are the local partners telling us. And I've had those discussions with, continue to have the discussions with those areas that are about to have the BCU model rolled out to around that preparation. In terms of the actual figures around emergency response calls, the Central North BCU, I won't rehearse what we've rehearsed many times in terms of the unacceptable dip in performance that we saw when the Pathfinders came in, and the huge amount of work to get it back up to the level it should have been. But in the Central North BCU, it's above the performance in terms of response times is above the Met average, and in the East area it's just below it. But it's absolutely, it's come back up and is tracking, almost tracking the Met averages, and is not out of kilter with the performance that it had seen in the way that we saw it at the beginning, well, sort of was it spring last year, from March onwards last year. It's incredibly important that that is absolutely maintained, not just in what were the Pathfinders. We're trying to move away from them being Pathfinder as because it's business as usual now, and it's incredibly important that we have that confidence. And will be tracking the emergency response times for the next two basic command units that are rolling out in the southwest and the west.
Okay, and in terms of some of that performance that was said was poor performance in response times, increased dispatch times due to the change towards one radio channel for the whole of the BCU, longer response times so units have to cover greater geographical area. They're all being looked at, evaluated for the next rollout. We think we're going to do better.
Yeah.
Can we turn to look?
But there's also been there's also been learnings from the Pathfinders. So
yeah.
the model has changed and been tweaked. So we don't have the same the issues that happened, especially at the east around the geographical size. That has been factored into the model. It's not that we've just taken the model, the Met have just taken the model and implementing it without any changes. That learning from those learnings from the Pathfinders have been taken on board, and that's what's happening in terms of rolling it out in the southwest and the west.
And given the administration's view about victim satisfaction and the concern around some of the BCU Pathfinders that dropped more than what was on boroughs, what's the view about that?
The view, victim satisfaction is a concern across London, not just in the Pathfinders, and it was the subject of an oversight board just before Christmas. It's coming back to an oversight board because there's been an in-depth analysis around what is driving that victim satisfaction and what we can do to put it right and what needs to happen to put it right. It's an absolute focus. There's been a considerable amount of work in really understanding what is happening and then how do we put that right, and that's coming back to an oversight, I think it's May's oversight board as well.
So in the past two quarters, it dropped by 12 points compared to the boroughs, where it's compared to a 6 percentage point change in other boroughs. So presumably that's going to be addressed in the new rollout as well. Do we understand why that may have been the case in terms of Pathfinders? Why it was such a larger drop than
some of this was to do with the way that some of the telephone operators were working, and it happened to be that it was those were Pathfinder areas, not just Pathfinder areas, and that there's a considerable amount of work being undertaken to put that right and to really understand what it is that's driving victim satisfaction, how you can make sure that when officers do go to an incident and are there for victims, that they have the right, they have the right training. There's been a rollout of training on victim satisfaction as well, because it was immediately picked up and seen as an issue. It's been taken incredibly seriously because it is so important that one of the key roles is around victim satisfaction.
Now, Assistant Commissioner, considering the consultation, we all know why you've got to do this. There's concerns around this table about how you've been doing this, right? And in terms of getting it right, in terms of the basic issues. Some are for it and some are against it and some are just, actually we should be able to do this, but it seems like a lot of hard work trying to get to where we need to get to. When are we going to have, so my borough, my two boroughs, Greenwich and Lewisham, is pretty poor about the public's awareness of what's going to happen in mergers. I can't speak for Bexley, but I can speak for my areas. When are we going to move out with the closed conversation, with the few, and start moving towards the many about what's happening to polices on their patch and asking them about their input? Isn't it a great time where we can ask them if they've got any information that could help the police in tackling crime? We could do that. I'm a great believer in riding on the back of those issues. I think it's been woeful on my starting point about the level of information out there. It's great for the opinion formers and great for some of the stakeholders, but it's not good for the general public. Right, so what, in your view, are we going to do to improve that in terms of people understanding what is happening to police in their areas, what do we think will change, and what is the service they can expect?
Can I just start by saying, you said we've got to do it. Actually, we want to do it. We really, sorry?
I'm still waiting. I've been on about this for a number of months.
No, sorry. We want to do this change. It is going to help us really to to approach problems with a much better scale. It'll have more expert people dealing with those problems, and it'll be easier to manage, both issues and staff within these larger units. So, we are very committed to doing this, and we wanted to do it, for the operational benefits that we expect to get from it. And the signs from the Pathfinders are encouraging. The East area, you mentioned response times, it's at its best response levels for, for some time, including in the two precursor boroughs. So we do really want to make this change. In respect of informing people, I think that we're doing it, rather deliberately as each borough goes live. So we first of all had the Pathfinders, we very much wanted to learn, and we've learnt a lot from them. And the new implementation in the West and South West is different because of that learning. And we're engaging with not just stakeholders but communities as well as we're going live at the end of May and early June in the South West and the West. I'm not clear about when your communities will start to hear that information. I like your idea about moving forward with intelligence at the same time, and I'll suggest that when I return. But I think that our engagement is very much designed to be, this is happening and it's happening now quite soon. So it's much more relevant for people when they hear about it rather than something that's quite far off in time.
Okay, and we're about to go live on the next two rollouts of the two?
We are, yes.
And so from learning the experience of the past pilots, am I right in thinking, was my expectation that it's going to be less tinkering with the pilots, that we should be able, we won't get it right even in the next two. I'm not saying it's going to be 100% all plain sailing and it's all going to go smoothly. But am I right that we're going to see less problems and less changes to the pilots in terms of this next round of implementation?
Certainly learnt an enormous amount from the two Pathfinder experiences, and we've changed things quite considerably. So Sophie mentioned the response times and large borough distances, the significant changes to have sectors so that people are responding across a smaller area. That's a big change, and it's come from the learning from the Pathfinders. So yes, we would anticipate that there will be fewer problems with the next changes. The other thing is we've had, certainly in the South West, for example, a strategic partnership group and a partners board. So there's been very, very good consultation leading up to this change with everybody that we work with to make sure that the impact of the change isn't grave on them, and that we can enhance our partnership working as we make the change.
Okay, thank you.
I'm looking forward to that process with Croydon, Bromley and Sutton. That will be that'll be a challenge all round. So, well, thank you very much for that. As you know, we're not going to ask direct questions around electoral fraud. We had a briefing last week and another informal briefing tomorrow. If after that we require more answers, well, I will write to you separately on that subject. I will move quickly on to the item around call handling. Myself and other members have had representations from residents around lack of satisfaction, in essence, with call handling. Bear in mind, we are encouraging residents and Londoners to use 999 and 101. It's very disappointing when often they have a poor service. They have often, and I use that word in an anecdotal manner, but often, and we do have some figures around that, is that occasionally calls get abandoned. There's an increase in 999 calls, which then has an effect on the 101 efficiency, we're told. So we all have examples of complaints from residents whereby, indeed, they either just give up calling a 101 call, or indeed, they're not even connected and the call falls away. And this is clearly not good enough. So, Assistant Commissioner, what are you doing, and what is the Senior Met Command doing about these abandonment rates on 999 and 101, please? No, I've had a conversation. Thank you. Sorry, please.
Okay. You're absolutely right. There has been a very large increase over the last 18 months in 999 calls, and we obviously will always prioritise those calls for emergency response. So about 12% a year increase in 999 calls, and that increase is continuing to increase. We're still on average answering 999 calls on average in 16 seconds. So it's still a very, very strong response. Part of maintaining that strong response to the 999s is an impact on the 101s, and I'll come back to that if I may. Our figures have a misnomer in them, this thing about abandonment. Actually, if BT, who have the line when the caller calls in, if they can't get an answer from one of our call centres within about 20 to 30 seconds, they will try another call centre to get that call answered quickly. But that shows as an abandonment, and of course it's not. They've still got the caller on the line and they still have control of that line. If they have to go to another force for an answer, which is rare, but that shows as another abandonment. So whereas in fact you might still have your caller on the line. And I haven't been able to fathom why we call these abandonments, but I think it's misleading. When that happens, we certainly wouldn't want it to happen, because we do want our average call response times for 999s to be as low as it is. The important thing I think about the 999 system is that at the chance of someone not receiving an emergency response when they need one is very, very low. It's remote, because in fact British BT have that line. If the caller does abandon the call and go off the line, we are able to return the call to them, and we do almost invariably. And if we can't get through to them and understand why they called and what they need, then we can choose to send a response to them, and we often do, and we always do if we're not sure why they called in the first place.
It's a so-called private number. There is systems whereby you'll know, BT will know the number and you can call them back.
BT know what that line is, and we're able to go back on it. So the 999 system is very thorough, very careful, and still on average under 20 seconds to answer. But the increase that's led us to have to prioritise answering those 999 calls has been very strong, and it has come with a lot of calls to the 101 number in their own right. What happens when you phone 101 is relatively quickly you get a message which is saying you could also contact us by digital means if you want to, and quite a lot of the calls end at that stage. And we're now receiving over 120,000 digital contacts every month. So we've got members of staff 24/7 on responding to digital contacts. So whilst I think that it's not nearly so easy to trace these calls, and I can't say how many of the 101s do change into a digital contact, because we don't know the lines for many of them, it is clear that many of them are putting the phone down and then they're going to go online and contact us digitally. So those are sort of the context of how we're working. I'm very happy to explain the measures we're taking around recruitment, filling vacancies and so on, if that would be helpful as well.
What I will do is I will probably write to you, because I like to have an understanding of the delays on 101, on the numbers of calls. You've given us some figures, and we have figures around 999, which is clearly a priority. That's yes. A fact. But it would be good to understand the efficiency of the 101 system. And I'll write to you separately around that, if I may, and pick up as well. While I think of it, can I welcome very much the students, young people. Thank you for coming along today from Burdett Coots Primary School, Westminster. You've probably worked out, because you're very bright young people, that we have a very senior Met officer, a Deputy Mayor Policing, and we're here to ask questions about keeping Londoners safe. So I really appreciate you guys coming along. Thank you so much. Caroline.
I just want to pick up on the 101 number, because some data I'd got in answer to a mayor's question shows, if you look at the last quarter of last year, the longest time someone rang 101 before it was answered, so in October it was 4.5 hours, in November 3 hours 18, December 2 hours 16. I mean, that's an awful long time before anyone even answers the phone. I don't understand why someone would hang on that long, but clearly they want to report whatever this issue or concern is. What are you doing to address that? Because I think that is very worrying. And there's one thing, you ring up, you get told you could report it online, you don't want to, you hang on for a few minutes, you speak to someone. But hours and hours waiting just to speak to someone?
It's like you, I don't understand that. And, you know, if that is the case, then that's it's a terrible experience for that person, and wouldn't condone it in any way. So I'll I don't understand that, I'm afraid, and so I can't say that that has happened or explain why it has happened. We have to take people away from the 101 system to answer the 999 calls in order to keep those calls handled. We've also been running with vacancies within the call handling staff, and we've also had some incidences of sickness that have taken people away from those duties as well. In terms of our kind of recovery program for this, we have a new recruitment process which has completely transformed from the one we used to use. It used to take us about 9 months to recruit somebody. We've now got our process down to 5 weeks to offer, subject to vetting and references, which is much improved. We're also using honest case studies to help people understand the demands of the role, and particularly the psychological impact that those roles do contain. And we're testing for resilience in the recruitment process, so we're hoping that people who are recruited now will be, really able and resilient to answer the kinds of calls we get. At the moment, we've got almost 10 times the number of applicants for our roles, so we're very positive about filling our vacancies, and we're moving to do that as fast as possible and to bring those people through training, which I think will make a real difference to the answering times. Well, I know it will. And we've got an internal wellbeing strategy, which the staff have really contributed to, and it includes things like a review of the shift patterns so that they are much more going to be much more comfortable, I think, going forward about the conditions of work that they are working within. And I think that itself will improve resilience for the whole of the function. So I would be positive about the future and future improvements. And I know that the person who's running this, Dave Jackson, is very positive about some of those changes and the impact that they will have. Again, I'm not going to say how quickly that will translate into real changes, but they're working very hard to make sure that this service does improve.
Well, just following on from that last point. I've been going about this for some time as well. I mean, last year I was getting reports of particularly in the merged borough of Camden, getting reports of people waiting half an hour, 20 minutes, then just giving up. And when I raised it, I forget which senior officer it was I raised it with, but I think it might have been Craig. And he said, well, we're recruiting more people, which is what you just said, and it's going to take till September this year to get on top of it. But now you're saying you don't know how long it's going to take. Yeah. So is it September this year, or is it September next year, or what, before you get on top of this? And what do you think is a reasonable time for someone to rate for a one-on-one answer?
Yes. Well, so in terms of, I mean, Craig may well have been right, and I'm just not as informed as he is. I can certainly give you information after the meeting as to when we're bringing people in every month now to fill these vacancies. As to when we estimate they'll be completely full, I don't have in front of me. So, but I could give you that information afterwards. But I don't want to I'm certainly not contradicting Craig. He may well be right, but I don't want to undermine what he said by speculating myself.
But if you're recruiting a certain number, yes?
Yes.
Yes, right. So that number then must indicate what you consider to be a reasonable time for someone to be hanging on for an answer on a 101 call. Because otherwise you'd be asking for more people if you thought that was going to be too long. So what is your target time for response to 101 call? What do you think? How long do you think it's reasonable for someone to wait for an answer?
I don't know the target time, I'm afraid, and let me give you that afterwards, because you're right, it is absolutely involved in the level of the numbers of staff in this whole function, as is the increase in 999 and other calls coming in. Sorry.
Commitment to answer 101 calls within 30 seconds.
So Sophie's helped me. The commitment is to answer a 101 call within 30 seconds, 90% of the time.
And so to compare that with 999, the target is what for 999?
Sorry. 999. I haven't got that. It's within.
I think he said under 20.
Well, I think you said the average was under 20.
Yeah.
But there must be a target for that as well.
We'll have a target for that. Yeah.
I mean, the reason this is important is I was meeting my borough commander last night in Barnet at SMB meeting, And he said, well, one of the reasons we're going to be able to improve our response times is the fact that people can report things by phone, online, or whatever. Now, if your improvement in response times is dependent on the people being able to report by phone and they can't get through, that will inevitably impact on your response times in the borough mergers, won't it?
It certainly could do. And, you know, please don't read into the fact that I haven't got some of this information at my fingertips, you know, any lack of commitment on the Met's part. This isn't my core role. So I've, you know, reviewed it obviously for today, but I don't have some of those figures to hand. What I absolutely know is that the person running this function, Dave Jackson, is really committed to improving it and is making strides in doing so. And yeah, he's absolutely clear that all sorts of things run from getting this right at first contact. If we get this right at first contact, our satisfaction levels are very high. If we don't, then that impacts on victim satisfaction. If we can resolve something at first contact, we don't have to then send a follow-up response. That's a much better experience for the person who's contacting us. So we're really committed to getting this as good as it possibly can be.
Presumably the demand will go up if this is going to be where you're trying to push people towards doing that rather than having people come round to them. What's your average response time on a 101 call now?
March 18, it was 306 seconds, so it's just over 5 minutes, which is not good enough. I'm not in any way pretending that's good enough.
I think that rests your case.
Well, I think that makes the point. And just a technical case, presumably...
It's absolutely, in terms of 101 response times, there has been serious issues in it. There's no getting away from that. It's something that I know the Met are taking incredibly seriously. I certainly am scrutinising them as part of the quarterly performance reports because I know people are hanging on. We also know that it does have an impact on 999 calls, because if people aren't getting through on 101, they are more likely to ring 999 and it's not an emergency. So that we have to deal with it in that way.
Just going back to the abandoned calls, I take the point that some may then immediately abandon and just go online, and it may be difficult for you to tally one with the other. But presumably, if somebody's phoning up about volume crime, you know, graffiti or something that they want to report, they might just give up and that never gets reported, and that becomes reflected in your crime statistics, which may be therefore under-reporting, or under-recording rather, the level of these volume crimes, mightn't it?
Absolutely, it has a number of different impacts, yes.
But of course, graffiti wouldn't be a crime. It is reported into local authorities as an
environmental issue. It could be
I know, but let's,
any antisocial behaviour.
Antisocial behaviour, if it's crime. We're not seeing a drop-off in reporting in crime. It may be that we are seeing some under-reporting because we know that obviously actually crime is increasing in London and outside of London. In terms of the call centres, that recruitment process is underway, and I have had assurances that we'll be up to proper staffing levels, and we should see a change in the call answering by the summer. That's a long time since we first knew that there was a problem. There have been changes in recruitment, and they have made serious efforts to bring down the time it takes to recruit. I hope and will continue to make sure that we put pressure on to look to make sure that that is absolutely delivered.
Well, I mean, just to make the point about crime statistics, when I asked this question last year, up to in the 12 months of September last year, there were 860,000 abandoned 101 calls. Now, that must reflect in the crime figures. Yeah, even if only half of those are people who just give up, and that's a substantial number.
Well, the 101 is also the main contact number, so they're not all calls to report crime or social behaviour. It might be that, you know, they're looking to contact someone in the Met and to need to be put through. So it's important, I think, for the public to have one number that they know that they can use to start
I accept
contacting
that,
the force.
But, you know, I think that probably does reflect, that proportion must reflect on crime numbers. The technical question I'm going to ask is, presumably, do the 101 calls go through to the same call handlers as the 999 calls, or is it a sort of a separate bunch of people who are answering them?
It's the same people, but the technology that isn't able to deprioritise a 101 call and prioritise a 999 call. So handlers are trained to, some of them to take 999 calls, some of them to take both sorts, some to take only 101 calls, and they have to be physically moved onto different places in order to prioritise the 999 calls. In future, we may well be able to have technology that can prioritise the 999 above the 101, but at the moment, we haven't got a technological solution for that.
Presumably all calls go to the 3 different call centres, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Clearly it's an unacceptable position, we all agree on that, and we'll obviously return to this. Okay, moving on to the next set of questions, which is disclosures and crack trials, which is referring to the Met review in January. Andrew.
Yeah, Helen, can you tell us what progress you've made in reviewing the disclosure cases? Well, obviously it came out of the recommendations from the Allen case.
The recommendations identified 600 active serious sexual offence cases, and all of those now have been jointly reviewed by the CPS and the child sexual abuse team. In every case there was an action plan set, mostly that was to review digital devices more thoroughly than had been done in the past, and to download some others and carry out that review. So we've still got 220 cases moving towards trial, and we're still carrying out forensic downloads of devices in several of those cases. So all have been reviewed, the actions are still being done underway, and they're all being monitored every week. We think the trials that are currently going forward of those cases will last until at least September or October of this year.
Have any been abandoned?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
But there are still some presumably there are therefore still ones awaiting a decision whether to go ahead or not.
Yes, I think so. I think there are some where those actions are still
I think it'd be useful if you can write and tell us if any have been abandoned and how many where the decision is still to be made one way or the other. I think that would be useful. And then, continuing on the question of disclosure, it's not just, you're looking at rape and serious sexual assault, but the issue of disclosure goes way beyond that. I mean, technically it applies to all crime, but particularly, for example, cases involving harassment and fraud. Are you looking at disclosure in those sort of cases? And how are they being reviewed?
Yes, absolutely. So, whilst the initial case was a sexual offence case, and then the reviews were of sexual assault cases with the CPS, we have a disclosure improvement plan which covers every offence type in every case, and that's now been implemented right across all of our activity, and that includes a range of different measures, from training for all sorts of different groups of people to a central case management team which will review all not guilty plea cases before trial, and also disclosure champions at every unit who've received additional training. So we've really strengthened the number of people who are confident and aware of disclosure, and we've got the case management team which will also check every case that's going through to trial.
Can you tell me how many harassment and how many fraud cases have been reviewed?
Not here. I can probably give you that information afterwards. But not,
well, that would be helpful. And again, if you let us know if any have been abandoned as a result of review of disclosure, that would be useful, and how many decisions remain to be taken would be useful.
Yes, I will do my best. I'm not sure what information we can give, but I'll do my best to give that. And bear in mind that some of these cases have, or some of these, for example, the case management team will go live in June. So we're moving through review, training, strengthening confidence, and then the team will go live in June.
Well, I'm interested in cases which had already been charged in particular, or was subject to indictment, which had gone some way down the track. That would be very useful. If you want a sort of cut-off point, I think that's where I'd be looking. And how many officers have you got doing this review work on I'll call them historic cases, for want of a better word, although some aren't obviously historic?
So we initially had 120 officers carrying out the review work, and we still have 65 doing that work, and we're gradually transitioning towards the disclosure champions, the case management team, replacing that initial surge of officers.
And are those officers are presumably detectives, so it's put another strain on your detective numbers?
I'm not sure, actually. I think I don't know the mix, but so I'm afraid I don't answer.
Again, that's another question perhaps you can find out for us, whether these are uniform officers or detectives that have been pulled in to do this work.
I can. I think that, it doesn't both uniform and officers and detectives carry out disclosure activity. So whilst detectives obviously do more of it and would have had some extra training when they did their detectives training, nevertheless, a uniform officer is able and will be suitably experienced to review these cases, and I'm not sure that the workforce mix will tell us much.
And in relation to 65, how long is it going to be before they can get back to whatever they were doing before?
I'm afraid I don't know that. No. But we're always reviewing these numbers, and whether they will go back to their former roles or join the case management team, I'm not sure.
Well, perhaps you can let us know how long it's going to be before they can get back to whatever else they were doing or should be doing or will be doing. Okay?
Yes.
Yes, if I could explore this business of the numbers further. One of the merits of having a large workforce is that you are able to transfer people fairly rapidly, because you've told us a large number of people who were, I think it was 160, who were transferred to dealing with knife crime very rapidly. You told us right at the beginning. You were able rapidly to second 120 people these matters, and you've given us lots of names. You say that it's a case management team and there is a unit and there are disclosure champions and so on. And that suggests that you're going to have permanently a fair number of people doing this work. You've told us there are still 65 people doing this. Are you able to give us any idea how many police officers are going to be involved in permanently, if you like, checking on the CPS? Or is it the CPS checking on you? I'm finding it hard to discover who is responsible for failure to disclose.
I don't think either of us are checking on each other. Our teams, and we expect to have 47 or so police officers and 14 police staff in the case management team, which will be the permanent team reviewing cases. Their role absolutely is to make sure that the police officers preparing those cases have done their job well, and to support them in making sure that the disclosure and the other aspects of case preparation have been properly done. So they're checking and supporting good practice within policing. Our joint improvement plan with the CPS is exactly that. It's a joint plan, and the CPS are working on their parts of the process and the decisions that have to be made within that process of case preparation, and we're responsible for our part of the decisions in our part of the process. So it's much more of a collaborative approach than a checking approach.
If it's collaborative, is there collaboration on the funding of this? Because presumably there must be CPS staff, because I think you have just now suggested to us there are a total of 81 people who are employed by the MPS on doing this work. That presumably suggests that nobody was doing it before.
There are 61 planned for the central permanent case management team.
Staff?
Sorry, no, 47 police officer posts and 14 staff.
Okay, so that's... okay, 61, not 81. Yes, thank you.
And it certainly doesn't imply that no one was doing this before. We will still have the individual case preparation officer's responsibility. So they officers have themselves received training. They already received training when they initially joined the organisation, and they would have been trained on detective training courses as well. But we've put extra training in, really to build confidence, so that they really understand both the importance of getting disclosure right and the process to do it, and that confidence is very important. They're supplemented by disclosure champions who are doing their day jobs but have extra expertise and experience in managing disclosure, and it's a complex process. And then they're further supported by the central team. So we always had resource in this function. But the central team is bringing that resource together. It will be based at our basic command units, but it'll be a team that can work together to make sure that we generally improve our disclosure practices.
champions presumably will be doing this all the time.
They'll be doing it as well as their day job. So
Oh, really?
Yes. They're not permanent.
So, and you've told them each one of them is going to, there's going to be one of these in each of the command units. Doesn't that mean that these champions, if I can put it this way, are going to be doing a large number of tasks? Or are you anticipating, because the process is going to be so improved and the CPS are going to be so much better than they were, that this is a task which is going to become less? What I'm driving at is that clearly if you had these people there before, these cases wouldn't have occurred in the first place. So if you're improving all your procedures, you're not going to need them anyway.
I think we'll always want disclosure champions, and you know, the Met has champions for a range of different things, and they are intended to be people who have greater experience, perhaps greater confidence in something, and are the sorts of people that you can go up to and informally say, can you give me some advice, some support, explain something to me, can you answer questions that I don't really want to ask my supervisor because I don't want to show my ignorance, but you're a friend who's here to support me. So you're doing it on top of your normal role. I think we'll always want them because I think people don't carry out a disclosure process, you know, routinely and regularly. And sometimes when they come to do it, there's some difficult decisions to be made. And having those champions, people they can informally ask, will always be very helpful. And I suspect our case management team, which is the permanent full-time team, it's pretty small, but I think that will probably stay in the longer term, really to make sure that our cases going forward for trial are as strong as they possibly can be.
The case management team always made up of a mixture of police staff and warranted officers?
It's likely to be, yes.
Is there not a case for having a permanent expertise for this, that they should all be staff rather than warranted officers?
I suspect as we go forward we might well look at the workforce mix, and it might change. I think at the moment it's valuable to have police officers in that team who've actually been part of case preparation and can talk to the officers about what are the lines of inquiry, what are the points that are needing to be proved on this particular set of circumstances, and therefore what proportionately do I need to do around further investigation and disclosure.
Thank you, Chairman.
I think the point being made very well is about the degree of uniform officers performing duties that could well be performed by staff, and I think that's not lost, hopefully, on you. Moving to the last set of questions, is officer training. Some members of the committee recently had some very good visits to Linden and Gravesend, and one of the focuses of the visit to be briefed around the detective entry course, and we've got one or two questions around that one.
Yes, thank you, Chair. If I can do this in two parts, and most of my questions are directed to you, Commissioner, Assistant Commissioner. The first set of questions relates to personnel and specifically the issue of detective shortages, and then I'll ask you a couple of questions on training itself. So, picking up the issue of detective shortages, how confident are you that measures such as the new direct entry scheme will be sufficient to deal with this problem, particularly as we are told that the Met has, as you yourself have said, that there are not as many recruits as you had hoped through this particular scheme?
The new detective entry scheme is only intended to be part of the solution to the shortfall in detectives, and we will be bringing in more and more people through the direct entry scheme as the rest of this year goes on, particularly in the autumn. But more importantly, I think, or as importantly, we select about 120 from our internal workforce to become trainee detectives every quarter, and we'll be continuing with that. So the external entry combined with the internal transition of people from uniform policing roles into detective roles is the way that we're trying to increase our numbers.
Right, but in terms of time scales, I know it's difficult to predict these things, but in March last year, the HMIC FRS report said that you had 15% fewer trained detectives that it considers necessary. So, I mean, these things do obviously take time to build up recruitment, training, and so on. But
Yes.
how would you close the gap? I mean,
it's a really serious problem, and it's actually a national problem as well, that there has been a shortfall in people coming forward to become detectives, and also an increase in the sorts of roles that really, require that investigative experience and training. So the external entry route is a very important one. The internal conversion route is also a very important one, and we're also then thinking about whether roles that have traditionally been detective need to be filled by a detective, so we're keeping that under review. Good. And also, as we move into the BCUs, officers themselves, response officers themselves, under the My Investigation programme, are being trained to take on more investigations themselves. That will have the benefit of an officer taking an investigation right from its first being reported through to resolution, and that will also ease the number of detectives that are required in the organisation.
that was actually one of my questions, the My Investigation scheme. I take it that these are the officers the same officers who are now undergoing professional investigation program level 1 investigative skills as part of their foundation course. So is this scheme working, and does it help out? Does it give? Does it mean that that crime is still investigated properly by reducing demands on CID officers?
I think that, yes, it is intended to work. It's intended that the officer who first investigates the crime will continue all the way through. That's much better for the victim's experience and for satisfaction. And we're keeping a very careful eye on the sorts of cases that are given to those officers, because we mustn't overwhelm them, and we also mustn't give them complex investigations that are not appropriate for them to do. But all of that's being monitored as My Investigation is introduced.
And there was this streamlined detective entry course scheme. How successful was that? And I know that this is on pause as a result of funding cuts. So, Sophie, if you could also answer this question. How successful was the streamlined detective entry course scheme? And it's been put on pause as a result of funding cuts. Why did this happen, Sophie?
Shall I take that?
Yeah, if you can take the part about the success, relative success or failure, but very specifically the issue of funding cuts, if you could address that, Sophie.
So in terms of this streamlined detective course, in 2016-17, in that year, responding to what we were already seeing as a reduction in the number of detectives, there was a short-term initiative put in which identified people in their initial recruit training who might be suitable to move very quickly to become detectives. A few were identified, and a few did indeed, move on to take the tests and to become detectives. But it wasn't big numbers. And as we moved into the direct entry detectives, and also implemented that people could apply to become detectives whilst they were still in their probation, we decided that we would go with those two routes rather than with keeping this streamlined detective entry programme going. So we could go back to it, but at the moment, because you can apply very quickly and in your probation to become a detective, we actually think the route is there for people and we don't need to run this scheme.
Sophie, I could ask you about the funding side of things, that the scheme was has been put on hold because of funding cuts.
I think Helen's Assistant Commissioner is saying it's not because of funding cuts, it's because of there are the.
So I did miss that part.
Sorry, I think wasn't Assistant Commissioner saying that it's that streamlined pathway into becoming a detective has not been put on hold because of funding cuts, but because there are the routes by being able to quickly apply from being a probationer to becoming a detective.
Yeah.
I think there are issues. There obviously is issue around funding for the Met and nationwide. detective shortage is a nationwide shortage. It's particularly acute in London because of the size of London and the numbers that are needed in London. There are issues around, sometimes around police pay and regulations as to whether we need to be able to actually incentivise officers to apply to become a detective, to be able to take on that extra, the extra skills and workload and what that means and whether there needs to be some incentivisation. And then there's an issue about stretch, isn't there? A lot of the questions today, disclosure, to BCUs, to response times, is about actual officer numbers and staff numbers and stretch of the Met, and that really does come down to funding.
So if I can come back to you, Assistant Commissioner, and so I do apologize if I missed that part of the answer from the Assistant Commissioner about the streamlined detectives. But you have 30 investigative coaches who are mainly ex-police officers, and they are there, as I understand, to coach junior detectives. Is it just training that they do? Is there, or is there anything more?
In terms of the investigative coaches doing?
Well, briefing note says, well, this is when my colleagues went to Linden, that the Met have recruited 30 investigative coaches who are mainly ex-police officers. The idea is to coach more junior detectives and take some pressure off supervisors.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you tell us more about what they do?
Certainly, as our new direct entry detectives come in, the intention is that when they go to their boroughs and start their role, they actually have somebody who's very experienced, one of these 30 investigative coaches, who can support them in their caseload, not do the investigation for them, but give them advice as to how to go about it, really monitor and check that they're doing things right and they're being thorough. And they are going to be, I think, a very big step forward in the support of those officers.
Right. Just one final question before I come to the training part. I read a report in the press about bringing in retired detectives. I mean, is there any substance to this story? Or, I mean, this is bringing people in short-term contracts and so on to help...
to help with the training?
Well, not just training, but actually...
Some of those sound like they might be the investigative coaches.
It's the same thing, is it?
It might well be the same thing, yes.
Right, okay.
Most of the investigative coaches are former detectives.
That's right.
Potentially, we believe.
All right, so the investigative coaches do more than just training. I mean,
deliberately gone to try to recruit people like that who have had that experience and really can be supporting our direct entry detectives as they start their careers.
And finally, just...
You're in a minute, don't worry.
Yeah, I just want to come back on the executive coaches issue.
You finish your information.
Okay, just a couple of questions on the training side. We, of course, need more detectives, but obviously the issue of training is very important. So how do you ensure that lessons learned from operational policing, reports from HMIC, CFRS are incorporated into training?
It's really important, isn't it, that those sorts of studies, the reports, the number of studies that are done from different places really do work their way back. So partly we have a central team who look after all the HMIC reports, make sure that the recommendations are understood and are implemented. That team can report into my organisational learning board that I chair, and I make sure that the recommendations are being implemented. Within professional standards, we have a prevention team as well, and they particularly look at the recommendations from the IOPC, formerly the IPCC, and they, for example, they go into training and explain about the sorts of recommendations that have recently been made by the IOPC and talk to the people, whether they're on supervisor training or recruit training or detective training, talk to people who are going through that training about the way they need to change their practice. And then I think finally in this, I would also say that all of our people involved in delivering training go out and do operational tours of duty so that they make sure that their training practice is up to date and really fresh and their operational experience is up to date.
And finally, if I can ask you this, Assistant Commissioner, as I understand it, from 2020, you'll have an apprenticeship scheme which is going to be tendered out to universities. This will take the place of foundation training. Have you identified these establishments?
In terms of the numbers of people we'll be bringing in
No,
through that?
in terms of the institutions that will actually be providing this
We
training.
haven't yet, no, but we are working towards running our own apprenticeship degree level entry scheme, and we're very much looking forward to that, yes.
We'll be doing this in partnership with established
We will be doing it in partnership with higher education establishments, but they just haven't yet been identified, but there's a programme working towards that.
Right. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So, going forward, all officers will be degree entry individuals.
That's
You'll
right.
have to have the degree, which the Met will indeed put them through, hopefully, to that level of degree education to become a Met officer.
So there'll be three routes. You'll either join with a policing degree,
Yes.
so a specialist vocational degree, or you'll join with a degree, but it's not in a policing subject, so you'll do a conversion course.
Yeah.
Or you'll join as an apprentice, and over what's envisaged to be 3 years of initial training, you will become a fully fledged police officer, and you will gain your degree in that process.
It'll all be degree level. Okay, that's interesting. Sorry, Len, did you? I think.
Go back to the coaches in that sense, and we understand from our visit to Linden, it's 30. We hope to recruit to 60. But isn't the problem about the Met's performance, and including that those coaches really could do with working with the police entry, never mind direct entry, detectives as well? Some of their experience they've had over the years, providing it's good practice, not bad practice, could be quite useful to those. So why the distinction between direct level, entrance getting that level of service, and yet we know the detective capacity, because the shortages are going to be young, short on experience. Of course, they're going to learn on the job. Your existing supervision will be interesting because they'll be young and less experienced than maybe otherwise in previous years in the Met. Why just restrict them to that role?
I don't think they'll be restricted. If I know them at all, I think many of them will, want to offer out their services much more widely. Because we were doing direct entry detectives as it's quite a big change, and they're coming into very busy offices that are not used to supervising and managing effectively recruits very early in their probation. CID officers aren't used to doing that, whereas uniform officers are. So we wanted that extra support built in to support these officers as they came out, and that's why we've specifically recruited the investigative coaches. There's no reason why that couldn't be good practice for other people as they come on in, but actually the other recruits are coming into an established support and supervision arena, whereas the direct entry detectives weren't.
Helen.
I want to ask you about training of new recruits, because I did raise this when we went to Hendon. I'll be honest, I wasn't very satisfied with the answer. With many people, I'm sure I watched the recent Stephen Lawrence documentaries, and in that they showed officer training, which used to be residential, and it was an undercover journalist who exposed, just someone who was going into the Met who had clearly inappropriate attitudes of people. And I was asking how the trainers really tease out and understand the new recruits, and whether any of them may have offensive views, quite frankly, on different communities, and actually weren't really suitable for policing. And I didn't really get a satisfactory answer, and I was wondering if you're aware of what sort of ways recruits are being assessed to make sure we've got people who want to, celebrate and work with the diverse communities of London rather than having prejudiced views.
I'm certainly very willing to go through, the timetable and the specific interventions with you. Outside the meeting, certainly, obviously, right from the start, people are recruited and tested with those views in mind, and it's absolutely clear, I think, to everybody joining the Metropolitan Police, the kinds of values and motivations that we're looking for, and conversely, the ones that are completely unacceptable. And in the recruitment phase, that's checked on and tested. During a person's passage through Hendon, there are a number of different sessions delivered in different ways, including, for example, looking at the Equality Act, what protected characteristics mean, and those are discussion sessions where if views that were unacceptable came to light, the training staff and indeed fellow recruits in the past have reported this sort of thing. So there's, I think, a good regime at Hendon. It's not a surveillance regime and it's not looking to catch people out, but it is absolutely raising issues with people, listening to what they say, guiding them, and where people do have unacceptable views, in my experience, that does come forward and is reported.
Okay, so you think there are processes? Because when I spoke to the trainer there, the response I get, which I'm not going to say now, but I just thought, wow, gosh, that does not reflect what I would expect. And given we have had lots of cases, not just obviously Stephen Lawrence, but you look at those cases of the gay men who were killed in East London, and the officers just thought, well, that's a gay men's lifestyle. No, it's not, you know, that there are people have prejudices, and it's making sure that that's tackled and that our new recruits, you come in with the sort of attitude that we would expect.
Absolutely agree. I think it's vital, as you know, in recruitment, in initial training, and then, you know, in daily practice as well. I think, you know, it's really important that all of us are absolutely in tune with what London expects of us and the way that we need to be to police the city.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I thank guests for attending today? I've got you out at a decent time.
Thank you very
Deputy Mayor, can I ask the committee to note the monthly report from MOPAC and the answers given? You'll note that there's a list of correspondence between us. I think after this meeting, Helen, you've taken a list down, and we'll write to you probably to a memoir, which will help you. Item 11, can I ask the committee to note the remainder of its meeting dates for the 18-19 Assembly year, and to agree the draft work programme that we circulated earlier, that we will continue to work on. The next meeting is Thursday the 24th. I've no other further business. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.